Welcome to my ExcelPowerTips channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create, using Excel VBA, a custom dynamic Excel NPS function. And I've included the code so you can use the NPS function for your own datasets. So here's an example of an NPS calculation, Net Promoter Score. So we've got a total number of surveys of 300, that's in blue, and of which the promoters that scored 9 and 10, that's in green, that's 120. And those that scored 7 and 8, they're the passives, that's in peach, that's 130. And the detractors that scored a value of a number between 0 and 6 inclusive, that's 50, that's in brown. So the promoter percentage is simply the count of the scores of 9 and 10 divided by the total number of surveys. So that's 120 divided by 300, and that's 40%. And then similarly, for the passives percentage, we got a count of the scores of 7 and 8 divided by total number of surveys. That's 130 divided by 300. That equates to 43.3%. And then finally, we've got the detractors percentage counts of scores inclusively between 0 to 6 divided by total number of surveys. That's 50 divided by 300. And that gives a percentage of 16.7%. So the final NPS calculation is calculated by taking the detractors percentage, 16.7%, from the promoters percentage, 40%. And that gives you final score for this question, for which there were total surveys of 300 of 23.3%. So here we have Airbnb sample reviews, which is a limited data set. And in that data set, we've got information relating to city, and then we've got the review scores for 5 different questions relating to cleanliness in column B, check-in in column C, communication in column D, location in column E, and value in column F. And then above it, we've got 3 rows, one in green, one in blue, and one in yellow. The green row looks at only those rows that are not hidden, so only those that are filtered, and it uses a dynamic NPS function that looks at visible rows only. And then you've got the all, which looks at all the rows in the input range, whether it's visible or not, whether it's hidden or not. And then in the yellow row, you've got the variance, so the NPS score for all is taken away from the NPS score for the filter, and then you get the variance. So if it's positive, it's in blue, and if it's negative, it's in red, and that's reflected in the chart above. So it's dynamic, so that if you change the filter at the moment, the filter for the input range is filtered for Sydney. So these scores in green relate to Sydney, and the scores, NPS scores in blue, relate to all the countries in the group. If we choose another country, specific country in the filter, and let's go for Rome. So now we've got the filtered NPS scores for just Rome, and the blue line will stay the same because that's the whole group, whether it's filtered or not. And then the variance is now changed as well as the green row. So the yellow row has changed, so the numbers have changed, and therefore the values in the chart have changed. So in this case, the NPS scores specifically for Rome is better for each of the questions against the value for the entire group. And so if I show you the NPS function in a little bit more detail, if I open up for the filtered NPS version function, if I open up the function dialog box and the arguments, the parameters, and there's 2, there's input range and there's visible status. The input range relates to the column B, and that's relating to cleanliness. So when we copy the formula across, then the input range changes as well. So for the different data points for the different columns for the different questions, and we've chosen the visible status argument value as visible. So as the help information say, that processes all the visible rows and ignores all hidden rows. If I show you the blue row, and open up the function dialog box. So in this case, the input range is still the same, but this time the user selected a visible status of all. So that will process all the cells in the input range. So by doing it this way, it's dynamic. So you can make filters, and then you can make a comparison between a filtered NPS and a non-filtered NPS. So next I'm going to show you how to set up the Excel Custom NPS function using Excel VBA. So the first thing you do is you go into your menu, and then you click on the Developer tab, and then you click on the Visual Basic button on the left hand side, or you can press a combination of Alt F11 to bring up the VBA editor. I've already got the module set up and the function set up, but if you're doing this for the first time, what you need to do is you need to go into this workbook object, and then right click, and then you choose the insert option, and then you go for the middle option module to insert a standard module, and then you set up the function in that way. So once you've inserted the module, I've actually called the module, and you can do that in the properties box of the module. So I've named it here. The function works in this way. So you declare it as a function, and the name of the function is NPS. Has two parameters, one called input range, which is of type range, and a visible status, which is of type string, and the return type, because the NPS returns a single value and function return single value, and in this case it has to be a decimal for the percentage, so I've put the return type as single. So the input range is probably self-explanatory. So that's the input range of the range of values, scores you want to feed into the function. The visible status, you can choose two options. You can either choose all, so that will process all the scores in the input range, whether the score is in a visible row or a invisible row. So whether they're hidden or unhidden, it processes all the scores in the input range. But if you choose the visible status as visible, it's only going to process a visible score row, so it'll ignore any scores are in hidden rows. The next part of the function is to declare uh, local variables which are local to the function. So if you remember with NPS, we've got a range of scores between 0 to 10. And what we need to know is what the count is for each. So the count of zeros, count of ones. So this is reflected in the variable. So you got for the count of zeros, that's int count zeros, and going all the way to int count 10. There's also another count variable type integer, or which counts all the number of numbers within the input range. This part here, this variable is a cell, and that will be used as a looping variable. And the final declared variables for the local function is prom percent, which is for promoted percent, and detractor percent, which is single. So the next part is we look at the value or the visible status. And so if the visible status is visible, like I mentioned earlier, for both cases it does a loop. So if the visible status is visible, it starts the loop. So it checks each cell of type range in the input range supplied. And then what it does is for each cell, it uses this if formula. And this if formula, if I work through how it works from the middle, it checks the address of each cell, the looping cell in the input range, the address. Because we're looking at the address property of the cell, that's of type a column and row, and that will be absolute reference return. So you've got dollar, then you've got the column letter dollar, then you've got the row number. So that's wrapped in a split function, and the split function needs a delimiter, and the delimiter is going to be the dollar. And so what that does, it splits the address, it takes out the dollar, and then puts it into a array. Now that array is the array starts from a index of 1, not 0, unlike normal arrays. So what we need to do is, because the second part of the array contains the row, we need to extract the second element, which is index 2. So once the row number has been extracted from the cell address, that's fed into the rows property of the active sheet. And then the hidden row, um, the entire row, the hidden status is checked. If it's not equal to true, then that will mean we're only counting rows that are not hidden. Then we proceed into the rest of the calculation. So the rest of the calculation is, so what it'll do is, because it's only looking at visible rows only, it does the count. So it checks the count for the number of numbers in the input range. So that's handled by the int count all variable. And then this block here, it checks to see what the value of the cell is. So if the values of the cell is 0, for example, this one, it's going to increment the int count zeros by 1. Similarly, if the value is 1, then it's going to count the ones and increment it by 1. So that goes all the way down to 10. For example, if a value is for cell is 1, it's only going to look at this if statement and ignore the rest, and then these other if statements will be ignored, and then the if block finishes, and then it looks at the next cell, and that loops through the entire input range, all the cells in the input range, and does a calculation for all the counts for the zeros all the way to tens, and then also the total number of numbers in the input range. The next case statement, where if the user supplies a second parameter value of all, then whether the cell is visible in a visible row or an invisible row, it's going to count it. So this check here, to check if it's hidden or not, the row, doesn't need to be performed if the user wants all the cells to be included in the NPS calculation. So simply adjust the count of all the numbers, and then you got the count of the zeros all the way to the tens. And then the second final part of the NPS calculation is, as we saw earlier in how we define NPS, the promoters, we count for the numerator, the 9s and the 10s are added together, and that's the numerator, and then that's divided by the total number of numbers. And then for detractor percentage, it's a little bit more involved, so it's the same process. This time we need to count the zeros, the ones, twos, threes, fours, fives, and 6 total. Add them all together and divide that by the total number of numbers. And then the final calculation, which is return into the NPS name function, and then return to the worksheet, is you take the percentage away from the promoter's percentage, and that completes the calculation. Thanks for watching my latest Excel Power Tips video, and I'll see you soon on the next one.